Howdy, folks. I have a science lesson for you today. We're going to talk about artificial selection. So, artificial selection is the idea that humans, by choosing which animals we let reproduce together, which animals we let have babies together, and which seeds we choose to plant and which ones we choose to get rid of, we have over hundreds and thousands of years made the plants and animals that exist now very different from the ones that were around before we started doing that work. So, this artificial selection thing has been going on since the beginning of agriculture. So, way, way back in the second timeline of humans, when we looked at the idea that someone realized that you could collect these plants, plant their seeds, and then have them come up the same time every year in the same place. Or that you could take some wild animals you liked to hunt, lock them up in a big area, and then just kill them when you needed them and let them keep reproducing, and you give them some food and then you have them there. All of this is the stuff that helped humans settle down and stop living nomadic lifestyles in the first place. Some humans still live nomadic lifestyles, but in general, people were able to settle down because of this agriculture, this taking care of plants and animals in one place when all of that started. And as soon as that process of agriculture began, people started selecting. They started choosing which things they wanted to keep. So sometimes they would pick the animal that was largest, perhaps. Maybe if they had a big, huge field of wild boar, the things that kind of turned into pigs eventually, they maybe would only let the largest ones breed and have babies, and the rest of them they would eat sooner. Or maybe they would want ones that had smaller tusks because the tusks were kind of scary when you kept them around. And so maybe they would have the ones that had the smaller tusks breed because in general, their babies would have smaller tusks. And then if you kept doing that long enough, eventually you can really change a species. In the same way, that process happened for plants. So imagine you go out and you're gathering a whole bunch of, what could you gather? Let's say berries. And you find that one plant has berries that are just way bigger. Some of the berries are a lot larger. Maybe you would take part of that plant home and keep that one. Maybe you would replant that one's seeds. If you found one that was growing all scraggly and weird and had little tiny dinky berries, you would probably not take any of that home to try and start growing. That idea is the idea of artificial selection. So, because of artificial selection, we have things like broccoli and cauliflower. Because of artificial selection, we have dogs that are different. We have Great Danes and teeny tiny Chihuahuas and everything in between. We have fluffy dogs and scrawny dogs and all of that because of artificial selection. When you cut open a watermelon and it has like the little thin bit of green and then the little slightly bigger bit of white and the big chunk of yummy good stuff in the middle, that's because of artificial selection. Earlier watermelons would have had the green and then a huge bunch of white and then a teeny bit of good sweet stuff in the middle. Artificial selection is why we have all of those things. Almost anything you eat or any animal that you see on a farm or in someone's house is the product of artificial selection. So this idea is a big thing that has been going on for a really long time and has made the world the way it is now for us. So I want to talk with you about a couple specific examples. There are millions of examples. And if there's something you're into, I would encourage you to go investigate that one on your own. But just for now, we're going to talk about one specific kind of dog and one group of food. So I'm going to start with the dog. So you guys probably are familiar with wiener dogs or dachshund. The way it's spelled looks like it's dash hound, but that's because it's a German word and things get kind of switched around between languages. So those little guys with their short, stubby little legs and their big, long, stretched out bodies, those dogs are the product of artificial selection for people who wanted hunting dogs that could climb down little holes to chase burrowing animals. So remember that in the past, people have used dogs specifically a lot to help them hunt. And so in Europe, when they were using all of these little dogs to hunt, sometimes they would think, well, I really like hunting big things. I like hunting deer and boar. And so I'm going to choose my biggest animals, and those are the ones that I'm going to have reproduce. And that led towards some big, fierce types of dogs. Meanwhile, some other people thought, well, I like hunting rabbits and badgers and things like that. There's a lot of those on my land. So I need dogs that are little. I need dogs that can squish under a bush to chase an animal. I need dogs that can stick like their face and part of their body down an animal's hole to help get it out. And that sort of thought is what led to dachshunds, our little skinny wiener dog guys. When you look back in history, they come from Germany and probably started to exist in what looks like how they look now around the 14 and 1500s. So about 5,000 years ago, or 100, 5 or 600 years ago. And probably before that, there were still smaller dogs and skinnier dogs, but they weren't quite the way a dachshund we think of now looks. And there was still a lot of variation when people were using them for hunting. Now that people just have that breed name, that name that you picture the right dog, that's more of a person choice thing and less to do with hunting. But that's how we got that type of dog in the first place, was people needing to have skinny, small little dogs that could dive under bushes and go down holes. And so they only let their skinniest, smallest, short to the ground little dogs breed and kept the babies from those ones and kept doing that over many, many generations. This stuff doesn't happen like, in one generation or in 1 year. This stuff takes time. Now, when we think about the plant one, it's pretty cool because we have a whole bunch of vegetables that we eat, and they all came from the same wild plant. So there's this wild plant called wild mustard, and it is like a tall stalk. It has a few leaves off the side, not very many, and then at the top it has a little puff of yellow flowers. It looks a lot like just a tall weed. It doesn't look very special. It doesn't look like something you'd want to eat much of, but it is edible. And because people started bringing it back and growing it themselves, they started doing the process of agriculture, and they started choosing the seeds of which plants to use for the next year. They managed to create 5 or 6 or maybe more different vegetables. So I have this cool picture that shows some of them, and I'll link some pictures in the bottom of this video for you to go investigate further. But the idea here is that starting with this one plant, people who wanted different things made different plants. So if you start with that wild mustard and you keep getting the ones that have more leaves and bigger leaves, and you plant the seeds of those ones, and then when they all grow the next year, you find the ones with more leaves and bigger leaves, and you plant the seeds of those ones and do it again and again and again, then from wild mustard, you get things like, sorry, I struggle with these cameras sometimes. You get things like kale. Think about those big frilly leaves on kale. Those come from wild mustard that was changed. It was changed over a long period of time by artificial selection. Now, at the same time, if you take that wild mustard and instead of keeping the ones with the big leaves, instead you choose to keep the ones with the most packed together flowers, you start to go in a different direction. You start to create the things that would someday be broccoli and cauliflower. So think about how broccoli and cauliflower both have those little like kind of squiggly tops. Broccoli you can see the tiny flowers in, and cauliflower you can't. That's because the people who were selecting for bigger, more packed in flowers split off, and some of them made broccoli and some of them made cauliflower. They made broccoli by getting flowers that don't develop all of the way as quickly and getting them packed really close together. They made cauliflower by messing up the plant so much that the flowers don't even function anymore. They don't work very well, but they give you that crazy delicious, like all packed together cauliflower look. So let's look at a picture of that. If you look at cauliflower, you can see all of that white stuff, the part that we eat, that's the squished together things that should have been flowers, but with artificial selection, we've managed to change them into something else. Broccoli is, here we go, the same sort of flower situation, but with a bigger, more developed stem. Now, there's more. This doesn't stop because that same plant, that same wild mustard, got turned into other stuff. Think about Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts grow on a big, tall stalk with tons of little balls sticking off the side. Those are the sprouts. That's from wild mustard too. People selected for more branching off at the side and lots of leaves to collect on those little branches off. This took hundreds of years to make happen, but someone managed to get Brussels sprouts. Well, lots of people. Think about that. You couldn't start this work of artificial selection and necessarily get the results in your own lifetime. You could get the beginnings of some results, but in order for wild mustard to turn all the way into something like cauliflower, someone had to start the work and then pass that work on to other people and pass that work on to other people. Think about how many people's work went into creating these things that you just go to the store and buy now. And that's not even the work of the person who actually planted that specific seed and grew it this year. That's just the work it took to create the thing in the first place. I love it, and I think it's a little bit insane. There's one more example that we can talk about of stuff that is made from wild mustard, but you might have never eaten it. I haven't. Austin has because he's eaten everything. But it's this stuff. It's called kohlrabi, and it's like a big giant blob that looks kind of turnipy, and then it has lots of stems with leaves that look kind of like kale coming out the top. So to get that one, people selected wild mustards that had bigger, fatter stems and more of them and got them to like squish their way on down. All of that came from one plant because of artificial selection. When you look at a watermelon and it has that big, huge area that's red and good, that's because people planted the seeds of the watermelons with the most good inside and then planted the seeds of those ones that had the most good inside and planted the seeds of those ones that had the most good inside parts until eventually we got watermelons that look like we have now. You can follow this story for basically any plant or animal that we have. So I'm going to stop now because this could go on forever. But go investigate. Artificial selection is when people make evolution happen. Instead of letting animals and plants change based on what's natural, what's out in the world, we're changing them ourselves. We're taking it and saying, we want this specific thing and we can make it happen. And that's a little bit wild and a little bit really cool. So I would encourage you to go out and investigate. Maybe look at some things around your house, out in your garden, or any pets you have, and compare those to the idea of what those things might have been like before artificial selection was something that humans did. Have a good day. Go investigate, and I'll link a couple pictures for you to look at down in the comments area. Bye.